Today we'll be talking about our final, the final of the 4 cognitive skills, cognitive flexibility. And I'm going to start off with a little bit of a disclaimer today. So cognitive flexibility is not as well studied and not as well defined as some of the earlier skills that we've looked at. It's, we have pretty good ideas of how to think about things like memory, how to think about things like attention, perception. We have a good fundamental understanding of what's going on with all of those. But cognitive flexibility is not really as well understood yet. It's possibly more varied, and it's there's definitely a lot more going on. So with that in mind, just bear in mind that it's both a negative and a positive. There's a little bit less of in terms of holy wisdom to impart down from on high, but there's a little more to be discovered about it, and a little more room for creativity, and a little bit of flexibility in how we learn about this. So one of the things that makes cognitive flexibility so interesting is that it's whereas before we've been talking about attention and memory, and then the lower level process of perception. Now we're switching gears and we're talking about a more higher order process. Cognitive flexibility really has to do with the way that a lot of those other processes, not just the processes that I've been talking about, but also ways of thinking about all of your knowledge content in general, how you can work with that and use those in different ways. So cognitive flexibility, the most general definition I can give of it is it's talking about the ability to change the way we think about something. And so this is what allows us to do things like to take advantage of new circumstances. If you're driving along on the way to work and you see a dump truck overturned full of money or bananas or whatever you like, then you might be able to switch tasks a little bit to take advantage of some of the new possibilities that have been presented to you. Likewise, if you're, you can avoid getting stuck in too much of a rut and doing things the same way always planned out. It gives you some. It's what allows you to take opportunity of the advantages of new situations and to start thinking about new ways of doing things. And critically, this is the type of skill that is crucial to creative thought. We'll talk a little bit more about creativity in particular later, but cognitive flexibility is not identical to creativity, but it's definitely something that allows creativity to happen. So I'm going to start off here now with an easy question for all of you. So I'd like you all to think about it for just 5 seconds or so, and then raise your hand and try and answer, what is a bachelor? So what's a bachelor?
A bachelor is someone who is not married.
Someone who is not married. So is a baby a bachelor?
Could be.
Someone who's eligible to be married, or married, engaged, but not married.
Okay. So what about...
Male.
Okay, that's a good one. Must be male. What about a freshman in college? Would you typically think of a freshman in college as a bachelor?
Nope.
What about a widower? Is a widower a bachelor?
No, these widows too old.
Could be an apartment. Could also be an apartment.
It could also be an apartment or a degree. That's true. So with that in mind, leaving aside the degree and apartment,
A suitable,
although those are very good.
a suitable man of marriageable age who has not been married before.
Okay, so that's a pretty good one. What about the Pope?
And who has not taken a vows.
That's
A suitable and available man.
able to marry, not yet been married, who's
Okay.
male, or one bedroom.
And then
Usually lives in your bachelor apartment.
yeah.
And
then what
has a
about
bachelor degree.
what about somebody who has been who's in a stable relationship and living with his girlfriend for 10 years or so? What if they have a kid together but aren't married?
So I think that's
Not
available.
eligible.
That's why that's not eligible.
Yeah.
Or
Oh.
available. And eligible,
Not eligible in my
suitable.
book.
He should not make himself available.
No, he definitely should.
Okay. So all of this is to point out that what seem like really simple definitions at first glance can be a little bit more complicated when we really start getting down into the nitty-gritty of thinking about what defines a particular concept and what doesn't. Similar examples would include something like, what's a strike in baseball? You know, if any of you are, I'm going to assume a passing familiarity with baseball, but a strike can include when you swing at the ball and miss. It can include when you throw the ball and it's outside of the strike zone. And it can include if you hit the ball foul, but only under certain circumstances. So even something like that is a fairly broadly defined and not particularly nice and neat category that we nevertheless turn into a nice and neat one if we have any kind of basic understanding of baseball, which I'm not expecting. It's not part of the course requirements, but it's a fun game. So. Another good example is what is pornography? I know it when I see it. Stuart Potter. So again, it's a broadly defined category that we all have an intuitive understanding of, but it's really hard to put a label on it, even if you're a Supreme Court judge. So categories are not just simple definitions. Categories instead are based on a lot of the things that we've been talking about before and some of the things we haven't. So these would include things like our semantic knowledge, our knowledge of how things in the world are related to other things. And if you remember the discussion about prototypicality, those can help be involved in our knowledge of concepts. Another term to throw out here is something like family resemblance. So you can talk about things that are not strictly speaking part of the same category, but might fall generally under the same concept. So a good example of this is how we can have a concept of things that swim in the ocean that might include both fish and whales. They might not fall under the same category of animal or the same type of definition, but it's easy to involve forming a category based on things that resemble each other there. Another principle of categorization that we try to use, this is more of a principle, is called cognitive economy. Cognitive economy is the idea that we want to have the right number of categories for thinking about things. Theoretically, you can define everything in the world into its own individual category, and that is not co-categorized with anything else. We like to think about the world and categorize the world intuitively in ways that maximize their usefulness. So we would have a category for something like birds, if we're not a particular bird expert. If you are a bird expert and you need to use a lot of different categories of birds in your daily life, then you might further divide that into flightless birds, into songbirds, into tropical birds, birds of prey, all of those. So cognitive economy is the idea that we categorize things naturally into the right number of categories for us to use, in what we do. And this means that our categorizations are flexible. If you need to use a particular type of thing more, you'll start working with more and more categories for it. Most musicians will have far more categories for musical activities than non-musicians will, because we work with it. Okay, so those are some principles of how we make categories. Again, they're not simple definitions. They're really based on similarity and usefulness. Furthermore, there's different levels of categories. So I was talking about the example of birds, but another one you can talk about is the case of a chair. So a chair is what we call a basic level category. If you take a child and point to that and ask them what it is, they're going to most likely say it's a chair. However, you can have different types of chairs. So you can you might instead say that is a dining table chair, that is a rocking chair. That would be a more specific level of categorization. In addition, you could also say that's a piece of furniture, that's an inanimate object. You can describe different levels of categorization, and oftentimes the level that you're interested in looking at is going to have to do with the particular task for why you're categorizing it in the first place. So, things that are commonly paired with each other can provide another basis for categorization. So they don't need to be the same type of thing. They can just they can come about or come to our consciousness or awareness or our perception at same or similar times. Things that co-occur can start to belong to the same category. So things like feathers and flying, they're not necessarily related, but because they occur together very, very often, although not in this particular case, but very often we tend to associate feathers with flying. Now these common pairings of things can be learned either explicitly, you can teach it to somebody and you can point out the common pairings, or they can be learned implicitly by just being together over and over and over. As it turns out, people's ability to explicitly learn pairings and to categorize things based on that way turns out to be somewhat of a function of their IQ. People who are smarter tend to be better at picking up on that. However, our ability to implicitly learn categories is less related to our IQ. That's something that doesn't seem to be directly related to intelligence. Furthermore, people have the ability to learn even complex rules implicitly. So these would include things like grammar. Most of you, when you're speaking in your native language, you will almost exclusively follow the grammatical rules of your native language. You don't need to think about it. It's something you've learned implicitly. And furthermore, if you try and describe those rules to somebody who doesn't know them, you will more likely than not fail unless you've tried before, because we don't have an explicit knowledge of the rules of grammar. Likewise, something like athletics. If you learn to play a game like baseball or bowling, you pick up on a set of motions and a set of categories and a set of things that go together. It becomes more and more difficult to teach them to somebody explicitly, but we can pick it up implicitly. Music is another great example. I'm sure you all have good ideas about the types of categories and the types of associated ideas and behaviors that can come along with music. I point out this last one about women, fire, and dangerous things because this is actually the title of a very famous book in cognitive psychology by George Lakoff, who studied the Derbyal people they're an Aboriginal people in Australia. They have a very interesting categorization system where they divide things up into 4 different categories. And category number 2 includes women, fire, and dangerous things through a complex set of associations and going through all of them. So category number 1 is men, game animals, and the sun.
I did say this, I'll keep it really short. I had an exhibition titled "A Female Pokes the Fire," which was A for adjective that came out of the dictionary in this definition. But anyway, goes into that category of my years.
Yeah. So this is just this, by the way, is something that would seem, it's a perfectly natural way of categorizing objects in the world if you've grown up in a system. To most people who haven't, it seems a bit arbitrary, but hopefully arbitrary. So that just outlines some of the different ways that we can start start forming categories. One other way, and probably one of the more important ways, is through the ability to apply these categories or things in those categories to particular goals, to things you're trying to do. So some things can be better or worse examples of categories. One type of way you might want to categorize songs, for example, is songs that you can use to put a child to sleep. And so you can have things like that. You can have things that can be better or worse examples of that goal-defined category. So something like "Rockabye Baby" would be very good to put children to sleep, whereas "Call Me Maybe" or "Killing in the Name" is not as appropriate for that particular task. However, if you change the goals, if you change what you're trying to do, then you can change how similar items in the category are to each other. So if you instead categorize this as songs to play at a party, then for most of the parties that I would go to, "Yesterday" and "Call Me Maybe" might be better examples of those, whereas "Rockabye Baby" and "Killing in the Name" would be less good examples. Membership in a category is really a function of how the category is defined and what the goals of that category are. Or another category you might do is songs to play in the car with your parents. So these would be more or less appropriate. So, with this in mind, you can see that we have many different types of categories that are already in our minds, and many more that can potentially be in our minds. So, if you take a concept like giraffe, if I ask you how many categories does giraffe belong to, you could come up with thousands of categories that giraffe might belong to. Even if I give you something a little bit more complex, like Bach and Beethoven, you wouldn't have a very hard time finding quite a few categories that would fit both of those examples very well. So you could extend. So for example, Bach and Beethoven might be names that begin with B. They might be classical music composers. They might be German people. They might be people who are not artists. They might be creatures that have never been to outer space. You can come up with a huge amount of categories. And in fact, you can come up with an infinite number of categories. When I say infinite, I don't mean it in the figurative sense. I mean a literally infinite number of ways of categorizing these types of things.
They once were blue.
Sorry?
You just be correct, they
Yeah.
once were blue.
Yes.
Categorized in place, everything.
Yeah.
They look at stuff.
They contain oxygen.
They do.
So this is all to point out that the idea of assigning things to a category and thinking about what categories things belong to is fundamentally a creative type of act, because you need to figure out what's applicable to your current situation, and then you need to pick from this literally infinite number of categories what is a good tool, a good categorization to use to achieve my particular ends in whatever thing that I'm doing. So this is a good example of that type of thing. We had, in order to create an artistic structure, you can categorize things by some of the obvious qualities like color or shape or size, but you can go into further things, like we heard about things that used to be alive. That might be it's a useful category to use there. So.
Can I ask a question about the infinite number of categories? Would that change if you had a large number of items that you're trying to categorize?
Nope. No, it would be theoretically.
Like Bach, Beethoven, bread, ball, like if it was really, I was just choosing, and there were 25 items, and there had to be a common link. It's kind of like this game, right?
All you have to do is start throwing in numbers in there, and you can see why it's infinity. Things that are not in groups of 6, things that are not in groups of 7, things that are not in groups of a million and more. So And that's
So
just
you can
one
think of
way
not
doing it.
belonging as opposed to belonging, right?
Exactly.
Things that are not donuts.
Yep.
Sure, okay. I get it.
I heard that radio stations, music, classical particularly, they have a system that can categorize their music. So music for a rainy day, music from this period, and then they have a program that can reshuffle the categories depending on what they're looking for.
Yeah.
So they've had to enter in every song under several categories to be searchable.
If you have Netflix, they actually do that very, very well.
Yeah,
They,
action fan.
yeah, you might have dramas or British dramas or you might have, British comedies, things like that. There are thousands of different categorizations they have. We ended up watching 10 minutes of one Korean show, and now they keep showing us Korean dramas. It's like fourth on our list for some reason.
There's an interesting program too that the Visa has determined now patterns. When patterns change, they can categorize a person's spending patterns, and when that changes, they notify you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's actually a really good example of this in doctors who are trained in reading mammograms and looking for cancer. As it turns out, the signal for cancer in a mammogram is not just an obvious thing. It's not something that you can just show to a computer and they can figure out this one's cancer, this one's not. It's not the case that if you see a big white thing that's obviously cancer. As it turns out, doctors who have training in this have picked up very easily what is and what isn't indicative of cancer in the mammogram, but they're very not adept at explaining what it is, because it really ends up being a combination of different types of things. If there's this bit here and that, but not this, that kind of thing. So it ends up being a rather complex category that they're using to figure that out.
Okay, you said assigning things to a category is fundamentally a creative act. Could you categorize creativity, please?
We'll get to that.
Okay.
So before we do that, let's switch topics and talk about task switching for a moment. So task switching is another aspect of cognitive flexibility, and it's defined as the ability to change what you're doing quickly and efficiently, to go from doing one thing to doing another thing. So this involves a shift in your goals and in your perspective, so what you're trying to do and what you're looking for. And so this often entails changing the way in which we categorize something. And this is what helps us to not get stuck in a rut when we're doing things. So imagine you're sorting a deck of cards, and the cards all look something like this. You can imagine a couple of rules by which you might sort the cards. You could sort them by color, or you could sort them by shape, or you could sort them by the number of objects on the card. Now, if you ask people to take the cards and sort them as quickly as possible by color, say, just into 3 categories, and then you show a light and you ask them as quickly as they can to keep sorting the cards, but this time by number. The people will tend to slow down for a little bit when they do that first one, to spend some time to figure out the new categorization process and the new way of thinking about it. It takes a little bit of time to mentally shift gears to get into that new process. As it turns out, the ability that the length of time that people take to change is indicative of some of their higher order mental abilities, specifically their cognitive flexibility. That's being able to change tasks quickly and effectively is a good way of measuring it. So if you think about what changing tasks entails, it entails a lot of the abilities that we've been looking at before. First, you need to use your perception of the attributes to figure out what is in fact on the cards in front of you. You need to remember the particular rules in order to change between them, and you need to inhibit some of your prepotent responses. You're going to be very likely to try and keep going with the original categorization for a little bit, so you have to actually inhibit the old set of rules and try and reactivate the new set of rules. So you can think about cognitive flexibility as a higher order function, which is regulating a lot of these lower order ones and telling them how to work and when to go on and when to go off. So in that sense, that's a good way of thinking about it as this higher order process. And this is what gives you the flexibility to change your mental patterns. So another aspect of this type of task switching thing involves perspective taking. Perspective taking, you can, basically what we're talking about here is being able to take the perspective, in this case now, of another person. And that's a type of task switching, because you go from thinking of trying to categorize the world in terms that are fundamentally important to you, to trying to reconceptualize it into how another person might be perceiving it. So, for example, this screen is visible to all of you, but from my point of view, it's not visible. So that's just a simple example, but you can also think about this as involving higher order processes such as my needs or wants. So this can help us to start thinking about how we take other people's emotions into account as well, and not just their physical perspective. So you can think about questions like switching to thinking about how is her view different? Why would he feel that way? What would make them happier? And this is, of course, all rolled up with the idea of empathy. And when I say empathy, I mean it in terms of, in the way that empathy contrasts with sympathy. Empathy being feeling with somebody else, whereas sympathy is just a more distant care for somebody else. So here's a question for you. We're going to switch to problem solving, and I'm going to give you a little bit of time to solve, not very long, but a little bit of time to solve this problem. So you want to attach a lit candle to a corkboard wall. I don't know, you may have seen this one before. This is a famous example. And specifically, you want to attach this candle to the corkboard wall so that the candle wax won't drip onto the table below. And you get a candle, you get a box of matches, and a box of thumbtacks. And so the goal in this is to figure out how you can use that to accomplish this goal. I'll give you 1 minute to think it over.
What's the third item?
Sorry?
What's the third item I put as the third item? Thumb?
They're like this, the little
Thumbtacks.
things that look like that.
They're like push
Round
pins.
top.
Push
Yeah,
them
to
to the
push
side.
them. Yeah, and you push them to the wall.
Yep. So no talking here. Just think about it for a little bit. I'll give it about 30 seconds. To think about it. Okay, so any ideas? I have one very eager hand here.
My question is, can you use the box? Could you open the box and put the candle in the box with a thumbtack and then affix the box to the wall?
That's exactly how you do it.
That
It
is-
took me so long, I couldn't figure it out, and I was like not going to the page with the answer, like trying to get it.
Oh,
Yeah, so that's the idea.
yeah, it's the box.
I want to blow the candle up too.
Yeah, I thought that too, because I've got matches, right? Blow it out, stick it on, light it up again.
Oh, the matches are in the little pouch.
Yeah, so you end up pinning the box to the wall. This is, I don't know if this is the origin of the idea of the phrase thinking outside the box, but it's a very good example there. And the way that psychologists like to think about this type of process is overcoming functional fixedness. We think about the box as what the tacks come in, and that's its function, that's what it does. In order to solve this problem, you need to overcome your attachment to, get out of the rut of thinking about the box in that way and start thinking about it as part of the solution as well. So you end up you end up finding a new category for box to be in. It can be thing to attach to the wall rather than just thing that the thumbtacks are in. You find a new category for box here. And this fundamentally also involves switching perspectives. So you can see how these concepts are really tightly intertwined and how they relate to problem solving. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about creativity proper. So I want to open up the floor here and ask for thoughts as to what is creativity. If anyone wants to, I'm not trying to trick you on the other side, so feel free to throw out some ideas.
I think it's a nimbleness of the mind that allows it to travel laterally and up and down outside what a normal thought or perspective would be,
Okay, yeah,
and also to connect connections that aren't previously there.
that's a good one. Okay, so making new
I think
connections.
it's more like, instead of linear thinking, it's a circular way of thinking. So you're starting with an idea in the middle and then you're working out, like this, like a giant spider.
Okay, any other thoughts on creativity?
I think it's context dependent. I think what's creative in one context might either not be creative in another context, or might be differently creative or more or less creative in another context.
Okay.
Yes, I think generally it's ability of the mind to find not trivial solutions, new solutions, or maybe very paradoxal solutions as well.
Okay.
And to add to that, the word kind of with its usefulness, which might not be a useful word, but anyways, I think it has something to do with the function of what is brought forth.
So that's another good point to raise here. You can talk about so imagine sitting a 4-year-old down at a piano. One who might not have seen a piano before. They will play something, and it will be a good learning experience, but it might not be the hallmark of creativity. This might just be could be. There's something. I think we all have an intuition that there is something that separates separates the art of a 3-year-old from a Jackson Pollock painting. There's
It's something about being deliberate.
It's based on previous experiences.
okay, yeah. So that's another thing that we can think about in there. Yeah, and so we have the ideas of making some remote connections, about thinking about different patterns of connections. We have this idea of usefulness. We have the idea of bringing in previous experience to it, and all of these, I think, seem to be part of what makes something genuinely creative. So I put one definition up on here, which might not be is not the only definition, but probably captures a little bit of what's going on. They've defined it as the production of novel and socially valued products. So this encompasses the idea that something creative, a creative solution does have to be new in some sense, and that a creative solution has to be appropriate or fulfill some sort of need of society here. That it's related to it's related to what's going on there.
And we're going to enjoy hashing around lots of definitions of creativity through the rest of today's class, so this will come back around.
Yeah.
Sean, I wanted to check in with you and see if we thought we might be within 10 minutes of finishing your lecture. If so, great. And if not, then could we consider when we might take a break within the next 10 minutes and just pause your lecture? Not right this minute, but sometime in 10 minutes.
It's probably about 10 minutes.
Well, there we
so,
go. Fantastic.
okay.
I have just one question is that I can't help but think when I hear the production of novel socially valued products, immediately it feels potentially dismissive
Yes,
of
it is.
creativity for lack of
Yeah,
especially
I know, I
young
don't think
people.
that is at all.
Because again it kind of makes me think of when people make a distinction between people as consumers as opposed to citizens. And again, I'm thinking of that 4-year-old sitting at the piano. If they touch the keyboard and they hear these sounds, I think creativity has more to do with context in a way, because what is creative for someone of that age is very different for someone that's 10 times their age. But it has something to do with exploring and also having the ability to turn one's emotions and thoughts, manifest it into something external.
Okay. Well, so for emotions and thoughts, I think that's a really interesting dichotomy there, because you're capturing, in a way, two different aspects of creativity. You can have, if we want a broad definition of creativity, we can think about creativity that encompasses not only artistic expression, but also creativity in, for example, mathematics, creativity in engineering, creativity in a lot of other types of things, which might not have so much to do with expression of emotions, but do seem to have this idea of putting knowledge into use, into expressing knowledge in some way. So why don't you know what? I think actually, if you don't mind, maybe this is because we're going to get into a big discussion. I feel it coming on. It's in my knees. So why don't we think about this, and we'll take a short break now, and then we can come back and finish the rest, and we can continue with a discussion of creativity.
Then friends, let's come back at 8 o'clock, and in that time, could someone in your group happily clean up your lovely things that are going to consider signing up on our fantastic wall for your activity presentations or your practicum. So,
one last event, talking about definitions of creativity. There've been some good ideas passed around. I don't want to spend too much longer on this because we are going to be delving into some of this and what Nicole is doing later on.
seriously delving. Good delving.
But there's we did get a little bit of pushback to the idea of this socially valued part of the definition here. So one thing, so people, there's been a little bit of talk about how this might not apply to, say, the creative endeavors of young children, for example, things like that. I think. So, does anybody want to speak to that a little bit more?
Well, one thing that I wanted to say that I thought about when I went in my walk was that I believe that creativity is a process and not a product. And so I find it interesting to try to define a process. And so, and certainly in early childhood, in my experience with performing arts, it really is process based.
Yeah.
Also, defining something by a product by its very nature ends it and puts a box around it, in my mind. You know? So it doesn't allow for.
I think it can lead to a product.
Of course, but it's not limited by.
That's not good.
But isn't that then
So-
creation? Isn't the product creation, and creativity is the process by which we arrive at a creation? Word conceited.
And I think it also, like, I keep just thinking about context, like, kind of like the idea of if a tree falls, no one's there to hear it, but like if a Zen master draws in sand and then wipes it away before anyone sees it, and that has created something that would be socially valued but is not socially valued because it doesn't exist within social context to be valued.
Okay. So these are all really good points, and I like that I like that people are engaging with this, because I think it really helps to start getting at what really counts as creativity. We'll go into more on this later. The only thing I want to add to this here is that a lot of these things that I'm hearing really don't speak so much to wiping away with this concept, but more of an expansion of the concept of creativity. I think it's very easy to think of, for example, a 4-year-old's art as socially valued within the context of their family. I think it's, there are plenty of people who go to middle school recitals, so God bless them.
But can I just interject for a quick second to say that I actually think that creativity doesn't necessarily rely on the approbation of others or values placed upon it from outside, and it actually that's what I'm getting at about process,
Yeah.
is that the social value could be like completely internal and of one person.
Sure.
So the wordings are maybe a bit confusing.
Okay. Yeah, and again, I don't think this is the foremost hallmark definition of creativity, but it's nice to start to engage with some of the terms so we can think about it. It gives us a little bit of more insight as to what really applies. And one thing that I'll urge you to do during the second half of this, when we start discussing this more, is to not only think about what counts as creative, but to think about what doesn't count as creative. Because if we end up with a definition of creativity which is all-encompassing, then we haven't really captured anything in the process at all. So it's really useful to think about what does and doesn't count as creativity.
But isn't there an infinite number of categories?
Sure, but there's an infinite number of categories that it doesn't belong to as well. So, and if you've gone too far enough into math, you'll recognize that some infinities are bigger than others. Okay, so
Can I answer that, or should I hold on to what
we'll
you
take
said?
one more and then we'll, yeah. You can go ahead.
So I started seeing the definition of creativity having a product attached when, I think some people in the business world really got into the notion of creative problem solving and innovation, and they started to define creativity as having a product that was useful in, according to a different value system than, let's say, some kind of innate creativity. So I think, I'm not saying one or the other is right, but I also like the notion of creativity being a process and disconnected from
Well, I think,
product.
so again, I do need to cut this off at some point here, but one thing you can point to in this particular one is that we're talking about, the definition here is not the product itself, but the production of the product. So we can think about the same way about thinking something that you would use to get at that. I think the point about whether it is actually used is an interesting one. That's another one we can start thinking about more later. But yeah, I think that we can start working with some of these terms to build a more useful definition of what creativity is. The point I'd like to emphasize in here, though, before we move on, is that most definitions of creativity, not all, but most, will include some aspect of newness and some aspect of appropriateness or usefulness. It's not just, it's easy to make something that's brand new, but to be really creative is generally thought of as something which is appropriate to the situation in which it is. It's not just a completely random throwing together of elements.
But you mentioned Picasso, for example, and his paintings. How, useful that is.
Well, if you want to go by dollar value, it's very useful.
No. Okay, well, Van Gogh, it was, he didn't sell it.
Well, we can talk about that more later again, but
I'm going to get very excited and do this right now, so I encourage you guys to go, look, these are all definitions of creativity that we're going to explore soon. So let Sean, lovely Sean, keep going forward.
yeah. Okay, so another way of thinking about creativity is that creativity is something that involves problem finding. So not just problem solving, but the ability to find problems that haven't been pointed out before and then solve them. So a good case is to think about Apple in the case of the iPod, which nobody even knew they needed until Apple invented them, and now they're everywhere. It was just not even thought of as a problem to be solved. This is why Apple is typically thought of as a creative type of company, because they're very good at problem finding. Now, this type of process, not just problem finding, but most types of creativity in general, also require background knowledge, as was pointed out before. It's more than just in order to come up with generally with really useful things, with really new and appropriate types of processes, be they products or music or processes. You generally need to have some good amount of background knowledge to bring to the situation. This is the old adage that you have to know the rules before you can break them. Oftentimes creative processes will involve things like shifting perspective. You can think about the way that we solve the candle problem. That involves a shift in how we think about some of the items there. And then another aspect of creativity that we can think about, which was mentioned before, is this idea of making remote associations. This is actually one way that psychologists like to measure something that gets at some of the fundamental parts of creativity through a remote association test. These are just some examples that might be on a remote association test. There's one word which is in common to all three of these items here, in each case. You can shout it out if you figure out.
Star,
Okay.
and the last one is candle.
Yep. Any takers for the middle one? These are supposed to be hard.
Last?
Yep.
Ah.
Last.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. So these are the types of things. People who are more creative will generally be able to solve these types of things, more of them and faster than people who have a little bit of a less creative personality. I'll show one quick video here, just because it encompasses this idea of remote associations quite well. This is a video that was produced by Radiolab, which, if you haven't listened to it, is an excellent show.
Radiolab. I like that video. But you can see that they're
they're making associations, some very close, some very, very distant. And they're also, if you watch it, you can also see the way that they connect between the categories as well. It's very, very well done. Anyway, listen to Radio Lab because it's excellent. They don't typically do videos. Okay, I'm going to talk about two last topics here before we go. One has to do with neural plasticity. So neural plasticity describes the ability of the brain to change. Now, from the point of view of an organism, some of the things that an organism will do are automatic, some of our capabilities, things like digestion. We're just automatically digesting. And some of the things that an organism, like that a person can do, are learned but foreseeable. We learn language, but we can pretty much know that every human is going to be learning a language. So we can develop ways of working with language neurally. But some of our capabilities, in fact a large amount of them, are unforeseeable. At birth, our brain has no idea that we might be a computer programmer or a musician or will want to play tennis. The ability to pick up those skills is not foreseeable, and the ability to pick up those types of skills is what requires intelligence. So the brain can't just be programmed for those abilities. Rather, the brain has to be able to change itself to be able to support all of those types of abilities. You need to be able to adapt to new things in your environment. And that's what neural plasticity is. Now, you can immediately see the connections between this and cognitive flexibility, because we're talking about the brain's ability to adapt to new things, to learn new things, and to change. Right here. So there's a real intimate connection between this neural plasticity and the types of things that we've been talking about here. They're also related to intelligence. Intelligence is really highly related to our capacity to learn and change and to perform well. When I say perform well, I'm not talking about in just one dimension, just one domain, but I'm talking about across all. People who are intelligent will tend to do better at pretty much anything they do, for the most part. And so this idea of intelligence encompasses all of the cognitive skills. And therefore, it's highly related to cognitive flexibility. We're talking about cognitive flexibility as this higher order skill that controls all of these lower level ones. This is intimately related with our concept of what it is to be intelligent. So because of this we know that training cognitive skills, training all of these, not just the high level, but all of them, and their ability to use them, is something that will help our performance, not just in one particular domain, but across the board. And this is something that we've seen is backed by scientific research. Training in these skills does help our ability to use those. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm just going to give a brief summary. We've been talking about cognitive flexibility, and overall, this is about changing the way we think. This involves categorization, both creating new categories and changing the categories that we use. It involves things like task switching, including the ability to change what we're doing and to change perspectives as well. It also encompasses other things like problem solving, and creativity is highly related to this. And then as last, I'll just point out the quote, "What good is a mind if you can't change it?" So that's cognitive flexibility. That's the last of our cognitive skills, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Yeah.